So I just wanted to take a minute to welcome everyone to our webinar on crafting a successful governance strategy. As Thomas mentioned, my name is Nikki Powers and Thomas is my guest today. Thomas is the Chief Governance Officer at StrongBlock, whose work is focused on making enterprise and consortium blockchains governable while maintaining their necessary decentralization. And I am here representing Object Computing, also known as OCI. We are a global technology consulting firm that specializes in business transformation through blockchain, AI, cloud engineering, and the Internet of Things. So what inspired our talk today is that, just like many of you said in your chat, it's so widely known, blockchain is so widely known for its association to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency. But a lot of people's awareness really stops there. And meanwhile, we are finding that today's business leaders are beginning to recognize that blockchain technology has undeniable applicability to all business transactions, even those transactions and processes that take place in highly regulated industries. But there's still something standing in the way, that barrier preventing blockchain systems from scaling into production and being widely adopted, and that barrier is governance. We are not the only people who have noticed this. IBM blockchain executive, as you see here on the slide, Stephen Rogers, he shared at the Blockchain in Transport Spring Symposium that from his perspective, the single most significant barrier standing in the way of enterprise blockchain systems scaling beyond proof of concept is governance. This was not the case even a few years ago, when the single largest barrier had nothing to do with governance, but adoption in the first place. So in Deloitte's 2019 Global Blockchain Survey, 53% of respondents indicated that blockchain has become a critical priority for their organizations, a 10-point jump over the previous year. So the question is not, should we implement blockchain within our organizations, but it's rather, how much can we grow our blockchain solutions without sacrificing efficiency? And how can we protect sensitive or proprietary information? And how can we share information across chains, ensuring that interoperability, if communication standards are mismatched across chains? The message is becoming so loud and clear that today, thanks to modern tools and software providers such as StrongBlock, enterprises can more easily scale beyond a simple POC. But in order to do that, and before they can take that step, the success of that initiative rests upon your governance strategy. So let's jump into those tough questions. That's why we're here today. Today we'll be talking about what is blockchain governance, why is it important? What does a distributed transparent governance strategy look like? And how is it different from governance in traditional transactions, meaning how we see it today? How can your enterprise design blockchain solutions that align with regulatory and fiduciary interests and obligations of its participants? And what should you look for in a blockchain platform, and how do you select the right one? Go ahead and advance the slide, thank you. So jumping into that first question, governance refers specifically to the set of rules and the protocols and the consequences that are put in place to dictate behavior and decisions either at an organizational or a corporate or even an individual level. Setting blockchain and cryptocurrency aside for a moment, we're going to take a quick look at an example of governance that many of us can relate to or that we're at least familiar with. So the example that I like to give is Sarbanes-Oxley, also known as SOX compliance requirements, where companies are required to maintain records and disclose financial information to prove that no fraud has occurred, while auditors serve as trusted entities who review and verify that information so that the rest of us can in fact trust that the financial information that they've shared is accurate and not altered to conceal some kind of misconduct. Another term that we're going to be using today is consensus. And consensus is the protocol and the process by which all members of this group develop and agree to support a decision in the best interest of the whole. So in this example that we're looking at that's familiar to many of us, such as SOX compliance, the consensus method is actually happening right here. You would advance the slide. By appointing auditors who are responsible for verifying information, we are in effect creating a consensus method today. And by creating consequences for situations in which those rules are not followed, we are in effect creating governance. The key point here is that the way businesses verify information today is similar to consensus within a blockchain. And there are considerable challenges to this method, such as the velocity at which information is being created. It is nearly impossible for humans to manage all of it. And when we rely on humans to power our governance and consensus methods, we introduce opportunity for human bias and human error. And the final challenge surrounding this process is that it lacks transparency because it places power into the hands of intermediaries who extract value from this process rather than adding value to this process. So this example of governance and consensus, the example of SOX compliance, is designed and enforced through the US Senate. So governance and consensus can be formal, just as we've shown it here, but it can also be a little bit more abstract, and that's what we're going to jump into here in a little bit. So before we proceed, let's just pause on this very important point and how these concepts contribute to the success of blockchain in the enterprise. We're going to pause on these definitions to ensure that we are grounded in this shared terminology. Consensus is the process by which we develop and agree to support decisions, and governance eliminates arbitrary, corrupt, or inconsistent enforcement of those rules. And it is now my honor to reintroduce Thomas Cox, the Chief Governance Officer at StrongBlock, who will share his expertise with us on crafting a successful governance strategy for enterprise blockchain success.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Super. So why do blockchain systems need governance? Because blockchain systems are decentralized. There is nobody in charge. And governance is the word we use for group decision making. And yes, blockchains are groups. So a bit about me. I'm Thomas Cox. I'm currently Chief Governance Officer at StrongBlock. Strongblock.io is our website. And I'm currently chairing a subgroup of the IEEE Standards Association's P2418.6. There's .6 is medical blockchain in medicine and healthcare. And I've got a subgroup on governance of medical blockchain that I chair. And formerly with Oracle, with PricewaterhouseCoopers and IBM. And I also led the governance design for the EOS mainnet pre-launch, all of the default settings that Block One created. I had a hand in either drafting them or eliciting them from the group or whatever, but I was the one person you can most blame for anything that's ever gone wrong on EOS. And I like to refer to myself, or I like to aspire, I guess I should say, to the title Godfather of Blockchain Governance. I don't know that I've achieved that yet. You'll have to tell me if you see me this way. But I have a coach I work with, and she suggested very strongly that I just pretend I'm there and say, if I'm that, how do I behave? And the answer is, well, I give seminars like this. So
and your fan club is here.
Yeah, my fan club's here. I got a fan club. I'm serving on standards committees. I'm doing the work. I'm showing up. I'm helping make things better for the industry. So yeah, I think if I keep doing this, at some point, people will refer to me to that in that way without my having to prompt them. So that's my ambition, is to be the expert. So let's talk about, when you say blockchain governance, like what does it even look like? What does this mean? What has to be governed? It turns out a lot of things. Let's say you've got data definitions that you need to make, or you're going to change a data definition, or you're going to add a data definition on an existing chain that's running today. You're going to have to get the agreement of substantially all the users to what the new data definition is, or what the change is, and specifically how it's implemented, and exactly when, and any other implementation detail. It's all going to have to get worked out in advance in committee, if you will, because everyone has to agree to it. Any sort of upgrade, even a bug fix, has to be coordinated through all the major stakeholders. What if you want to replace a lost key? There are blockchain technologies, EOS.IO being one of them, where if some user loses their key, rather than having to fork the chain, or rather than having a system where the user keys are essentially ignored, as with Hyperledger Fabric, that you've actually got keys that are meaningful, and yet you can replace them when they're lost. What about inserting correcting transactions? Now, if any of you have ever done finance, you know perfectly well that if we've closed out Q1 and we're in Q2, or heaven forbid Q3, and we discovered there's a problem with Q1 books, or a year ago, and you don't reopen the old books and start changing them. You put a correcting transaction in today that refers back to the original transaction, says, yeah, this is what it should have been, and here's the new correct balances. The ability to insert correcting transactions is crucial to maintaining accuracy over time, and to allow humans to make mistakes, and for the system to correct for them. But the very process by which that is done must be governed. The onboarding and offboarding of organizations into the group has to be coordinated. You're going to want committees almost certainly for steering and for change management in technical and functional work groups. So if we were to look at all of governance across the three layers, remember, I think we might have mentioned earlier that there's three sections to governance. There's deciding, there's implementing, and there's amending. Right? You got to decide what the new thing is. Then you have to actually carry out the decision. And then you may want to amend the decision-making process, or amend the implementation process. So all this stuff lends itself to automation, more or less. And so if we look at what's more automated or more automatable, it's things like on-chain voting, or collecting signatures to qualify something for consideration by the group, tallying the votes once the voting is done, enforcing voting periods, let's say. You can easily see those things may be happening on a blockchain, but that's not all of this decide layer. It's the mechanics of it, but it's not the heart of it. What about debating and campaigning? Well, even if you wrote a smart contract, you're not going to force me to use it. I might want to have a conversation, offline. So this is we get into less automated stuff. What about making up your own mind? I promise you, there's no smart contract, anywhere. You're not going to stick a chip in my brain and make me use some sort of on-chain system for me to make up my mind on how I'm going to vote. And then the establishing of social norms, which is, again, it's a give and take among humans. It has implications for how we vote, which things we vote for and against, how we listen to each other as we campaign and debate. But when I hear people talk about, governance should be on-chain or should be off-chain, it's a ludicrous conversation. People are just myopically focused on their little piece of it, and they're not noticing that it's a continuum from things that could be on-chain and arguably should be, to things that cannot ever be on-chain because they are human interactions. Similarly with the implementation layer, you may want to register and unregister voters, which if you're voting on-chain, you probably want to register on-chain. What about automated dispute resolution? You're going to need dispute resolution of some kind. Automating it is desirable if your system's appropriate for that. eBay has over 90% of their disputes handled by bots. but then, of course, they've got a very narrow use case. They've been doing it for many, many years. You may want auto-executing code for your upgrades. So once people vote for this code to go in, whoosh, it goes in automatically. It's not another human process after the vote. Auto-execution is both scary and much desired simultaneously, because if there's a bug in here no one caught, and you implement the auto upgrade, and then the bug fires off, you could destroy the entire chain because everyone implemented it at the same time because you said you would. So these auto-executing codes upgrades are scary for a reason. Also, part of the implementation layer is the idea of log rolling or side payments, which is, again, getting into this less automated side. Like, I'll vote for your thing if you vote for my thing, or, you know, I'll include your thing in this omnibus bill if you'll include my thing. And that's a natural, in some ways, reasonable part of the overall give and take of governance. Then planning and coordinating really has to be done with people. Then around amendments, you're going to need to make governance code changes to, say, change inflation or whatever, and then you'll have to negotiate those changes, and someone's going to have to write the amendment. So as you look at all this, each of these little boxes here is a part of the governance puzzle. Portions of it certainly can be automated, but the entire thing has to be thought about early on in the creation of your blockchain system. Because let's say you've decided that making up your mind and social norms and coordination are off-chain. Being off-chain doesn't mean there's no system for it. Doesn't mean there's no rules for it. Doesn't mean there's not a committee. Doesn't mean there's not bylaws. So all of these things need to be at least touched on in your governing documents. And all of this is part of governance as a whole. So you literally see here that some of it can be on-chain. A lot of it probably can't. And all of it needs to be in scope for your governance effort. One other thing I'll say about this last slide, you'll notice the strong block logo in the corner and the fact that the format's a little different on this slide than the other slides. That's because this is from one of our strong block internal presentations. This is actually a list of the pieces of code we're implementing now. And if you went on to strongblock.io today, you could not only have a free, this is a shameless pitch here, you could not only have a free single node blockchain up for 30 days, within 3 minutes, but you could easily find and install the on-chain voting code that you see up here with the tag alpha on it. Those are all implemented now. The signature collection piece, I think, is in process, and we'll have all these pieces up and running, I believe, by January, so that folks who want to do on-chain governance for their blockchain system will have a friendly place to go when it comes to Strongblock. So let's, again, talk in the abstract about any blockchain system. What are your steps for building governance? I've broken it down to this. And when I work with clients on either a blockchain governance health check, I've got a client right now in the Bahamas that I'm doing that for, or governance build out, where we're actually helping them design it rather than just audit what they've already done. You've got to know these things. You've got to know who your founding stakeholders are so that you know you're talking to the right people. And you've got a purpose for the new blockchain systems. You know what this kind of the scope of things is. Once you know the purpose of the system, you can define the scope for governance. And this is distinct from operational processes that are routinely done. For instance, when you first face the idea of changing a user's key, if there's no process and there's no code for that, then you need to invoke your governance to say, gosh, we need to replace a key and we don't have a way to do that right now. How shall we do that now, and how shall we do it moving forward? But then once you build it out as a known problem with a known solution, that whole question shifts over into your operational process bucket. It's just a routine thing. Oh yeah, next time a key is lost, we'll do that thing we did last time. And so governance is always handling gray area, and operational processes are always handling black and white. And so governance always has to take first crack at new problems. And when I say defining scope, that does imply that there will be things that will be out of scope for governance. That is to say, it's not up to the collective to decide, say, what length my hair is, right? I can wear my hair any length I like. My wife may have opinions on it, but the collective doesn't get to vote on it. So there will be things that are out of scope for governance. Those of you who are Americans, I think most people on this call are, The federal Constitution actually doesn't, it isn't a list of things that the government gets to do. The US Constitution is a list of things the government cannot do to you. And having a sense of what your governance process can and cannot do and defining that up front is wise. You can do things like we're never going to tell people what prices to set, or we'll never force people to reveal certain kinds of information. You may want to have a short list like that. In step 4, you're going to define your target stakeholders, the ones you're trying to recruit into the chain, not the founding stakeholders who are building it, but the target stakeholders who you will invite in to run on it. And for each of them, you want to know what their interests are. You know, in Bitcoin, the miners want to have really high block fees, and the people transacting want to have really low block fees. So transaction costs, you know, they're pulling in opposite directions, and the mechanism for settling that is a market mechanism. But it can get much more complicated than that. So knowing who your target stakeholders are, what each of their interests are, especially when it comes to the purpose of the chain, and how those interests may, in fact, be in conflict with each other, is very, very helpful. In the 5th step, you'll define your governance powers, processes, and institutions. So I want to pause here and tell you what I mean by this. So I talked about the power to change a lost, replace a lost key. Well, to actually carry out that power, you'd need a process. Step 1, somebody says they lost their key. Step 2, the people who have the power to replace keys receive notice and decide if they believe this person. And at some point, you'll say, okay, now we've got a process. What are my institutions? That is, who are the peoples, and who are the people, and what are the data entry forms, and what are the routines we follow that carry out the process to exercise the power. And you only need to set up 1 or 2 or 3 of these initially, a relative handful, and you'll give them fairly broad permissions. And then as this gray area stuff comes up, it'll be pretty clear, hey, we're going to use the governance process to assign this institution oversight of this new problem area because it's a lot like the problems they're already handling. Or we need a new institution because there's a new process to carry out one of the powers in a new way. And then step 6, you set up your governance mechanisms and code. That's things like voting, things like registering voters. I could go on at great length on that, but I won't, unless Q&A you guys want me to. I want to show you some typical structures for governance. If you've got a consortium or any kind of private chain, I strongly suggest you get a steering committee. Set up front, make it the umbrella for everything else. And anything that they don't want to handle, they'll have to authorize a subcommittee or a special purpose group or work group to handle. Since the steering committee doesn't want to handle a lot, they'll be responsible for creating additional structure over time. You don't have to think of everything up front. It's best if you don't. You will probably want a change management committee. That's one of the few I would establish around the same time I did the steering committee. And I'd tell the steering guys, we need a change management committee. Here's what they'll probably do. You and the steering committee need to populate the change management committee. And here's some default rules for you to follow in terms of representation, who's in, who's out, what proportions of different types of stakeholders need to be in there. You also need functional working groups. So change management is all about, staging in the next alteration, but the functional working group is going to say, hey, we need to respond to new KYC guidance. We need to change the functions, the definitions, the business logic. And then the change management guys will figure out how to roll that out. And then in addition to the functional working group, you'll probably want 1 or more technical working groups. Again, these could be multiple in terms of, how do we technically write the code to do X? We're worried about, quantum computing breaking our encryption. We want to do something new. The technical working group would tackle that. We would not expect the functional working group folks to have the knowledge base. But then, of course, they'd feed into change management, who would worry about things like scheduling. So you kind of get the idea. You're also going to want offices or functions, typically, again, for things like inspection, dispute resolution, and sanctions. Let me talk about each of these. Inspection may have to do with compliance. It may have to do with the dispute resolution function needing information that maybe one party has and doesn't want to give up, but they signed a contract when they joined saying they would give it. And so you can compel them, or maybe there's some code somebody wrote that allows specially empowered people to pull up certain data. Zero knowledge proofs would fall into this category. Ways to, say, show a regulator that you're compliant in certain ways without having to give the regulator a dump of confidential data. That could be important. Dispute resolution is, it can be very simple in initial design. Simpler is really your friend. And having something in place is crucial, because when you first get the team together, you first get the stakeholders together, you can say, look, we need a general purpose dispute resolution mechanism. Here's a draft. What do you think? And they'll tweak it and they'll be okay with it. Because when you design dispute resolution prior to a particular dispute, everyone's looking at the system being designed and saying, gosh, I don't know which side I'm going to be on. Am I going to be the plaintiff? Am I going to be the defendant? Am I going to be on the jury? Like, what is there even going to be a jury? And so, because you won't know which side of the fight you're on, everyone's incentivized to make the dispute resolution process as fair as possible. Once there's a specific dispute on hand, though, if you try to create a mechanism then, nobody's going to agree to it, because they're always going to see, well, you only want to do it this way because it's going to benefit you. It's extremely hard to decide on a process or a structure once there's an active dispute in hand. I mentioned sanctions. The sad truth is, all of the research I've read on the subject of consortia and of any kind of community organization or group function like a blockchain says that if you don't have at least some form of sanction, if it's all goodwill and positive vibes, you tend to not get the compliance you need. Sanctions do not have to be big, but they do have to be quick. And if you want to read more on that, Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for her work on a book called Governing the Commons. And since a blockchain is a kind of commons and we are governing it, you can imagine why that'd be relevant. She said that no long-standing group has ever managed a commons for any length of time successfully without sanctions. She's seen some try, but she's never seen anybody succeed. So decide what you want to do with that. You will probably, during governance, want to create documents like a constitution or a charter or a consortium agreement, something that will be legally binding. You'll probably have some sort of choice of law or jurisdiction. It may have the overarching dispute resolution clause in it that all agreements that can't be handled by the two disagreeing parties directly will be referred for final decision to the American Arbitration Association, right? Or whoever, just pick somebody. And because this is something that people have to agree to when they join, and it has certain, basic rules of the road in it, it gets rid of a lot of fights and disagreements up front. I suggest you document some sort of emergency protocol. You'll know it when you need it. Something happens and the chain's not running, or things are behaving really badly, or something seems very, very broken. Knowing what the emergency protocol is, and it can actually be arbitrary as long as it's clearly documented, so that you know who's going to do what and how they'll tell everybody else and how we will reach group agreement. That's huge. It's absolutely huge. We can give you examples if you like. Rules of good conduct. I occasionally run into folks who think that, well, it's obvious, or we'll just use common sense, which is just dumb as a brick. I got a note that someone says they can barely hear Thomas.
I can hear you just fine, Thomas, but if anyone else is having volume issues, please let us know in the chat.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to double check my my computer and make sure that my sound settings are such that it's going out correctly. Sometimes my system will actually reduce the outbound volume kind of on its own, which is a real pain.
It's stifling you.
It's bad, man. It's bad.
Need some governance.
There you go. Let's see. Yeah, I think we're okay. Looks okay on my end. All right. I'll just get really close to the microphone, and Steve's okay. Matt's okay. Okay, Mike, it's on you, man. Sorry. What did we say? Emergency protocol said rules of good conduct. You please don't tell me you're going to use common sense unless everybody went to the same frat as you at the same university. Okay. I mean, if you've got a monoculture where everyone has the same values and the same expectations because you were all raised together, then you can finesse this and say, oh yeah, we all know what to do. And you might actually, but if you play that card and you've actually, in fact, got a diverse set of stakeholders, expectations will not be the same. And you are inviting problems. So a simple set of rules of good conduct is good. I mentioned a dispute resolution method. I would mention it in the consortium agreement or other founding document. And you might want to have a separate document with a little more detail if that's appropriate. One next point I want to make is that there's a challenge around this thing called governance legitimacy. All modern governance structures and agents require a belief by the governed that the governing structure or agent is addressing key needs of the system and is staying within norms. And legitimacy typically comes from three sources: tradition, charisma, or something called the rational legal tradition. And you have a combination of these. That's great. So you've got some well-respected group of founders, including someone, maybe one or two charismatic people who set up a framework that includes a lot of rational legal bits. Oh, Mike's all cleared up. Yay, Mike. Excellent. If you can combine these, all the better. Rational legal is this idea of consent of the governed and following agreed processes, right? And if you don't have a subjective belief by the users in the legitimacy of the governance processes and institutions, their belief in the system and the project will collapse and the project itself will fail. And I'll give you an example of how governance legitimacy held back a project. Maersk spent millions of dollars in several years working with IBM on a Hyperledger Fabric, I think it was, system called TradeLens. And it was going to track all kinds of shipments across the world. Turns out that international freight shipment is ripe for disruption. It's heavily paper-based. It's very inefficient. So Maersk was going to get a big jump on everybody. And they announced this several years ago. And a big fanfare. And hey, look, we've signed up these 80 customers. And they had 0 trade partners. 0 of the shippers who they were working with on a daily basis were willing to put their data on the Maersk blockchain. And that was specifically because of a governance failure in the Maersk design. All of the trust nodes were being run by Maersk, which meant any dispute on what reached finality or any dispute on what was properly recorded in the chain, Maersk could just decide it. It's 100% on them. And I can't imagine a competitor in the world who would want to run their business on Maersk's system, where Maersk could have 100% control of what the truth was. I wouldn't do that. I can't imagine anybody else would. And in fact, nobody did. And it was over a year before Maersk finally decided that maybe if you join us as a trade partner, we'll let you run some of the trust nodes and we'll give up some control. Boom, they signed up 40 trade partners as soon as they did that. So, getting the governance right or wrong can really hold back or accelerate things. And it has to do with a subjective belief in fairness. I mean, there's nothing you could have pointed to objectively about Maersk's system that said it is objectively bad or wrong. It was just human trust. It's like they're going to retain 100% control. That's not even a blockchain. It's just a big, slow database. And it held them back. So invest in and safeguard this idea of legitimacy. And a related point is to require the users to use the governance tools, even manufacture a small crisis if needed, or use the governance tools for early, semi-meaningful elections or something. And the reason I want you to get your users to use the governance tools is the research shows that people who are familiar with their governance tools, even if they're weird and archaic, believe in them. And people who've never, been to jury duty and they've never taken a civics class and they don't know anything about the governance system that they're being subjected to, as soon as they are subjected to it, they don't believe in it. And so familiarity doesn't breed contempt. Familiarity breeds legitimacy. And that's why it's so crucial, I believe, to get the users' hands on the governance tools and make them use them for something, preferably a couple times a year. And when I say manufacture a small crisis, it might be a slight exaggeration. I'm sure plenty of crises will find their way to you on their own. But look for an opportunity to push things through the governance process. That is a crucial step in getting people familiar and therefore feeling that sense of legitimacy. Okay. I also want to touch on this idea of blockchain governance standards. Right now, if you try to talk blockchains with anybody who's been in the industry for any length of time, you'll find that there are 4, 5, 6 different pockets of language. People say block producer, supernode, miner, there's 3 or 4 other terms, trust node, validator, and they all basically mean the same thing, or if they mean different things, they mean only very slightly different things. But how would you know that, especially if you're a novice? And so we can't have a conversation about blockchain governance if there's no standard language. So that's the focus of 2 efforts right now. The IEEE Standards Association, which is a body set up specifically to create standards across all industries, actually has multiple blockchain standards going on right now. They have one for energy and transactive energy. They've got the consumer products group. They've got a healthcare group, logistics, a bunch of others. But none of them are addressing governance specifically, with one exception. Heather Flannery, who heads up P2418.6, which is the healthcare group, has created, because she's chair, she could just create a subgroup. She created a subgroup on governance and asked me to chair it, which I've said yes to. So this is the only subgroup existing today that has a governance standard function inside of it. And a new group called 2145 was proposed by me, and it's already passed its first committee vote, and it'll be voted on in January 2020. And if it is passed through review, then I will get my own standards group to work on blockchain governance standards. We'll focus on language, as I said. We had our first study group meeting on the 14th of November. Some next steps moving forward, if you want to sign up or just be informed about blockchain governance or blockchain governance standards, please drop me an email, thomas.cox@strongblock.io. I'm TVCOX on Twitter. And certainly if you need help with governance on a specific project, I'll happily put you in touch with any of the many folks I know in the space. Happy to help you myself. If it's a simple question or short, I just give people help pro bono. I'll pop on a call or whatever and get you oriented. Because the last thing any of us wants is for this incredibly cool and exciting industry to be slowed down or hurt by a preventable thing like us not understanding terminology or us not understanding this crucial but as yet underappreciated concept of governance. And that's the end of my slides. I'm wondering what kind of questions you've got.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That was really informative. So
thank you.
I think it would be great if we could turn to the audience and see what questions people have. Just go ahead and drop those into the chat box and we'll read them aloud and address those one by one. And while we're waiting for those to come through, are you comfortable, Thomas, sharing these slides with everyone?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll go ahead and turn these into a PDF and email them out to everybody who attended today, so you'll have this to refer to. We are also recording today's session, and so there will be a link available to that as well.
Super. Boxerman had no questions, but thank you for a good, clear introduction to blockchain governance. Thank you, Boxerman. Actually, I suspect, I know you had a question about consortia and legality. So if you don't mind, I'll riff on that just a little bit. I was looking into the formation of consortia, which is the plural of consortium, and it is very common for consortia to form around particular problems. And when a consortium forms, they have a charter and they have some governance processes they have to go through anyway. And they're probably going to have to, if they're any kind of a business consortium, they're probably going to have to align some business processes and have some shared data. That is about 80% of the work you'd have to set up your own blockchain anyway. So my belief is that we're going to see more and more consortia form, and then they'll go, oh gosh, we should probably have a blockchain, huh? And then they'll put their blockchain governance in there. They'll put the consortium governance on chain, and they'll transact whatever their shared source of truth needs to be for their shared transactions will be on chain as well. So I think you're going to see a whole lot more of these private blockchains showing up and consortia showing up to solve specific point problems around coordination of information. I'll get some questions now from Steve and Tim. Steve said, similar to the Maersk example, can you share more anti-patterns with regard to governance? Yeah, I'll tell you one right off the bat, and that is to postpone the governance questions until too late. If you try to scale up your proof of concept to anything like production, and you haven't had to sit down and said, okay, in an emergency, how will we respond? What's our steering committee? These are all questions that people don't want to answer. It's a lot, in my experience, it's a lot like disaster recovery plans. People don't want to spend time on them. They don't want to work on them. They would rather ignore them. And got some guys out of Costa Rica who are working on several ERP implementations where there's a blockchain as the single source of truth, lashing together 2, 3, 4, 5 or more different ERPs at multinationals. And with those enterprise resource planning systems, from different vendors, anytime you transfer data or product or service between two members of a far-flung international, conglomerate, keeping track of who did what to whom and how to clear that and how to balance the books and how to reconcile things becomes a nightmarish very quickly. And having them all write to and read from a single transaction system, a single database, it can be very simple when the data structures don't have to be huge or awful. Can make a massive difference, a massive improvement. And that's what they're finding. Grant Thornton sponsored the work that I'm familiar with, but most of the big systems integrators, including OCI, our host, are doing things like that. So my anti-pattern right there is don't leave it to last. Do put it on the agenda. Do set it up with some sort of tabletop walkthrough where you force the participants, the early participants, before you've really graduated into large volumes, to handle a couple of governance challenges. I can talk to you in more detail offline. I've actually got some stuff I do with clients for that. Great question, Steve. Thank you. Tim Waterloo asks, can we share additional real-life examples of hurdles that enterprise blockchains have met similar to the Maersk story? After we hang up, I'll think of a bunch more, but I'll tell you what comes to mind immediately. Let's see. Well, there's an outfit called MetaLedger. And I'm sorry, MetaLedger is the product or the consortium name. And Chronicled, it's like the word chronicle with the D at the end. Chronicled is the company. And they created a system for tracking pharmaceuticals from manufacture all the way through the life cycle, through the secondary market, resale market. So distributor buys a bunch of OxyContin and sends it out to all of his, customers, his big pharmacy customers. And it's like, we have more than we need. And they, it's going to expire eventually. So you kind of want to resell it on the used market or the secondary market. In the United States, you cannot do that without both the buyer and the seller verifying that case is a real case that was really made by that maker that says so on the box, and that it's gone through a chain of custody, and that the box you've got is the box they sent you. And about 90% of all of the pharmaceuticals bought and sold in the United States are going to be covered on this one consortium chain called MetaLedger. And they did that by sort of a stone soup process. Everybody knew they needed to do it because it's a federal mandate. None of the companies involved could propose a solution without everybody else thinking, well, it's going to be like a Maersk chain. It's going to be, it's going to benefit you. I don't know if I trust that. So Chronicle showed up and says, we're not a healthcare company at all. We have nothing to do with pharmaceuticals. We're a technology company, and we'll build it, and we'll convene the conversation, and we'll coordinate things, and we'll operate it. They found that having a voting system is actually not important. You want to avoid votes, actually. That they do have a strong upfront contract, setting expectations for all the participants of who's going to do what, who's going to provide what data, and they have a node operators agreement that all the different big companies involved, SAP and McKesson and so on, right? They're going to run nodes on this blockchain, and they each have to agree to a node operators agreement that says what the values are and what things take priority over what. They put together working groups on every different kind of problem. So a data coordination problem is a different group than a pharmacy nomenclature problem. And so they have working groups of all relevant or interested participants, at least that's how I understand it, based on their ability to contribute and their interest. And they do everything by consensus they possibly can. So they have a lot of chatter and a lot of working together. It's taken them 2 years, but they launched in October ahead of the November deadline, and it's running, and it's a terrific success. And it's an interesting example of a consortium chain where no one gets a business benefit from being in it so much as they get compliance. They get better compliance at a lower cost. So that to me is a terrific use case. If you want to know more about governance patterns, the Wharton Crypto Governance Workshop, which I was a member of in July, has put out a questionnaire, and several of the participants and I are interviewing different chains, public and private, using the questions derived from the Wharton Crypto Governance Workshop. And we're publishing our interview results as case studies on Medium and other places. And the Wharton guys are collecting a database of all the responses. So that'd be a good place to go to get more stories. Again, contact me and I'll get you in touch. Let's see. So that's my best answer to Tim. Hope that helps. I hope Steve and Boxerman and Tim are happy with their answers. Fola asked, what's the ideal size and composition of stakeholders for blockchain governance in an enterprise? That's like saying how long is a string? It needs to be, big enough of a group to cover all the stakeholders, so everyone feels like their interests are represented. But if it gets too inclusive, it gets bogged down really quickly. So I'm gonna tell you, I've seen success in particular with smallish upfront groups, like 5 to 7 parties, whatever that means for you, divisions, companies, competitors, with a strong vision and somebody to convene them. A good facilitator. Facilitation is crucial. And to get something up and running and to invite others into. Because once you've got something up and running, you can invite others into, the choice to join becomes much easier. And you've already worked out a lot of the fiddly bits up front. Second dimension, governance is the biggest barrier to blockchain implementation. What are a couple of hurdles after governance? Staffing is probably the biggest hurdle after governance. So you've got a proof of concept, it's running great in the lab. It's like, wow, we should use this now. And then you want to roll it out to all the divisions of the company. And you just went from running on a single server and 1 node or 2 or 3 nodes to now it's in production. And there's like live data on it that people are being paid based on, right? Or people are making multi-million-dollar decisions based on this data. Now you can't go down anymore. You can't back things up or nuke something and start over. You've just gone from test system to production system. And who's running all the nodes? Where are they running? Are the people running them competent to run them? Do we have our committee set up yet? Oh no, oops. And then no one wants to serve on the committees because they all want to treat this thing as some sort of utility that just works in the background and they don't have to think about it. Understanding of the governance challenge is a big issue. Staffing people so that each of the different work groups or each of the different divisions that are contributing have somebody in there who actually understands how the blockchain works. I had one guy I was talking to early this morning who's having great success implementing blockchains in large enterprises. And his big nightmare is as soon as they start to believe in it and want to start using it, they want to go from 0 to a zillion. And suddenly they need to staff up by, I need 30 blockchain people tomorrow. And if you're a small startup and you're helping build out proofs of concept for enterprises, you haven't got 30 people, let alone 30 you can give them. So staffing becomes an issue. I'll point out that the reason StrongBlock is doing what we're doing is to actually make the staffing issue not be an issue by automating a far greater extent than most have. Most of the issues you would need staff to do. Again, shameless commercial plug there, but true. So those are the hurdles after governance. That's my answer to you, Fola. And with that, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. If you got more questions, I'd love to get them by email. And happy to talk to anybody who'd like to talk.
Thanks again, Thomas, and thank you everyone for joining. As I mentioned, we will share the slides from today's presentation as well as the recording by email. And feel free to reach out directly to Thomas with those questions or on Twitter at Object Computing. And do stay tuned. We host webinars and events similar to this one regularly. So if you subscribe to our email or visit objectcomputing.com/events, you'll be able to stay up to date with all of those events coming up in the future.
Wonderful. And I want to give a shout out to OCI. I worked with them when I was an employee at Block One for a very intense period of time as we were getting the EOS code base ready. And they are tremendous professionals, extremely knowledgeable. They're doing a lot of different things on blockchain. And I think they're just a great technology partner. So I'm really honored to have been invited to be here with them.
Thank you, Thomas. We appreciate that so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Goodbye.